need some motivation, where should I go? To rise above limitations, get up off the floor. Teaching me new things that I ain't already know. Melanated elevation, let me put you on. Man, they all about creation, go check out they clothes. Brain mentally stimulating, inspiring growth. I'm learning my worth, it's dope, the merch reflect the glow. It keep me warm, but I ain't gonna lie, this hoodie cold. Let me check out the podcast, new episode. That's what's up, cause I like to live.
Peace, love, and elevation, family. Today's episode is about a debt that most of us have been paying since we were far too young to understand the terms, and how it quietly shapes the way that we punish ourselves long after the mistake is over, and how to finally close the account for good. Somewhere in your life, there is a mistake that you've already apologized for, already learned from, already grown past, and you're still paying for it. Not out loud, not in a way anyone else would notice, but late at night, or in a quiet moment when nothing's demanding your attention, it surfaces. The thing you said, the person you hurt, the version of you that made a choice you wouldn't make today. And instead of remembering it the way you'd remember a lesson, you relive it the way you'd relive a crime. Picture somebody you might know, maybe it's you. They said something cruel to a parent 15 years ago. In a moment of hurt they've long since made right. The parent forgave them years ago. The relationship is good now, genuinely good. And still, every single time that person sits across their parent at a holiday table, some quiet part of them is doing the math, recalculating the balance, wondering if today is the day they finally suffered enough to stop owing. Nobody's asking them to keep paying. The parent isn't asking, the relationship isn't asking. Only the ledger in their own head is still open for business. Here's the question worth sitting with. Who told you the debt was still open? Because somewhere along the way, a lot of us picked up a belief we never consciously agreed to. The belief that a past failure creates a kind of permanent inner debt. And that debt has to be paid in suffering indefinitely. Not because it does anything productive, not because it protects anyone, just because some invisible ledger says the balance still isn't zero. That's what we're calling moral debt today. And it's not the same thing as guilt. Guilt says, I did something that caused harm. Moral debt says, I am something that causes harm, and I will be until I've suffered enough to earn my way back. One is a signal, the other is a sentence. This episode is about telling the difference and about what happens when melanated people specifically carry that sentence, because we're not just dealing with our own mistakes, we're dealing with a world that's been quick to hand us guilt that was never ours to even begin with, and slow to ever call the account settled. So let's talk about how this actually works in the mind, because it's not random. Psychologically, moral debt is built from three components stacking on top of each other: shame, rumination, and something researchers call identity fusion. Shame is the first layer. Shame doesn't say, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am the mistake. That distinction matters because then it sounds like it should, because research consistently associates that kind of global self-condemnation with worse mental health outcomes than ordinary guilt produces. Guilt tends to motivate repair. Shame tends to motivate hiding. Listen to the difference in how these two show up in your own self-talk. Guilt sounds like, I hurt someone, and I need to make it right. Shame sounds like, of course I hurt someone. That's who I am. That's what I do. Same event, completely different sentence being handed down. Rumination is the second layer. That's the replay function. The mind pulling the same memory back up on a loop, examining it from every angle, as if turning it over one more time will finally produce a different verdict. And I'm so guilty of this. It won't. Rumination doesn't investigate. It just reconvicts. You're not learning anything new at 2 a.m, replaying the conversation for the 100th time. You already extracted the lesson somewhere around replay number 3. Everything after that is just the mind mistaking repetition for productivity. And identity fusion is the third layer. Now, this is the one that makes the first two feel permanent. That's when one moment, one decision, one season of your life gets fused to your entire sense of self. So a mistake from 10 years ago isn't remembered as something you did, it's treated as proof of something you are. A person doesn't say, I lied to someone once. They say, I'm a liar. Not, I failed at that business, I'm a failure. Notice what happened in that sentence. The action disappeared and the identity took its place. That's the fusion happening in real time. Right there in the grammar. Right there in the grammar. So put those three together and you get exactly what we're talking about. A person who can intellectually know they've been forgiven, who can recite the fact that the relationship was repaired or the lesson was learned and still feel bankrupt, still feel like the books aren't closed. The gap between what you know and what you feel is the moral debt operating exactly as designed. Here's a reframe worth sitting with. A younger self cannot be sentenced by a wisdom they had not earned yet. The version of you that made that choice didn't have the insight you have now, didn't have the nervous system regulation you built since then, didn't have the support, the language, the tools you're sitting with today. Judging that earlier self by today's standards isn't accountability. It's an unfair trial using evidence that didn't even exist yet. Some researchers frame mistakes as information producing events rather than proof of permanent defect. Not excuses, information. Data your current self gets to use precisely because your past self paid the tuition. Now, here's where this gets specific because moral debt doesn't land the same way on everybody. Now, if you spent your life navigating spaces that were quick to read you as guilty before you did anything, quick to assume, quick to police, quick to require you to prove your worth on repeat, then you already understand something most self-help conversations never touch. Sometimes the debt isn't even yours. Sometimes it was handed to you by a world that needed someone to blame, and you were the one standing closest. Man, that's really deep because there's been times where I did that to myself. There's been times where I've done that to others. And I may not have caught on to it in the moment then, but there was a recent conversation in a relationship where, I was talking to my beloved and that was what I was projecting onto her. And then we had a conversation that the context around that conversation led to us quote unquote separating or distancing or stepping back from the relationship. And then shortly after, I realized my projections onto her were really a big cause of a lot of those issues, right? And a lot of my viewpoints of things in the relationship itself. And I needed to put that and redirect that energy into my connection and connectivity to the Most High and also my better self, and also remaining productive and not holding her accountable to mistakes that I've seen in others, let alone that I've seen in myself or may have continued to have seen in myself in real time with her. And so anytime there was, an action, a deed or behavior or whatever the case might have been that showed up in her that reflected of a flaw within myself that I did not like, I noticed that I may have overly projected onto her the dislike of those things, and she felt like she was walking on eggshells and she always had to prove her worth, which was not my intention, and it was disguised as concern. But you can see how far that goes, right? So, research on racial stress describes something worth naming directly. Repeated exposure to discrimination and microaggressions can cause a person's mind to start converting external injury into internal blame. Maybe I deserved that. Maybe if I'd been better, this wouldn't have happened. That shift from this was done to me to this is who I am is not a minor cognitive slip. Research suggests that shift is psychologically costly and it can deepen trauma symptoms rather than resolve them. There's a study worth naming here. A paper by Watson Singleton and colleagues examining self-compassion in a Black American sample, the researchers found that self-compassion was negatively correlated with trauma symptoms, meaning people who could extend themselves grace tended to carry less of the trauma load. And self-compassion appeared to buffer the relationship between racial microaggressions and trauma symptoms specifically, meaning it didn't erase the microaggression, but it seemed to reduce how much internal damage the microaggression was able to actually produce. Sit with that distinction because it matters. Self-compassion does not make racism disappear. It doesn't rewrite what happened. What research suggests it does is interrupt the second injury, the one where the external harm gets rebranded inside your own mind as evidence that you deserved it. That reframing carries real weight in melanated communities, where respectability and survival have often been taught as the same lesson. Don't give them a reason. Don't mess up. Be twice as good, twice as careful, twice as composed, because the margin for error was never generous to begin with. Those pressures, inherited and lived, can be built and can build a hidden moral ledger where a person believes they have to keep paying for old pain indefinitely, whether the pain was self-inflicted or handed to them by somebody else's bias. You know the version of this. It's the meeting where you rehearsed your sentence twice in your head before you said it out loud because a stumble would get read as incompetence instead of a stumble. It's the interaction where somebody else's rudeness gets forgiven as having a bad day and yours gets filed away as an attitude. Over enough years, that unequal accounting doesn't stay outside of you. It moves in. And once it moves in, it stops needing anyone else in the room to keep charging you interest. This is part of the episode where I want to be playing with you. Refusing that false debt isn't letting yourself off the hook. It's correctly identifying whose hook it was in the first place. Let's slow down here because I don't want to tell you something that sounds true. I want to tell you what the research suggests. I want to be honest about that shape of that evidence. First claim, shame becomes more damaging than guilt, specifically when it turns into global self-condemnation. I am bad instead of I did something harmful. Research has tied that pattern to greater psychological distress overall, and I've definitely been through that path, been overly critical of myself and then that projected onto others. Second claim, self-compassion is associated with lower shame and lower rumination, and interventions built around it appear to reduce distress. One clinical study followed anxious and depressed patients through a mindfulness-based program, and researchers found that it increased self-compassion while reducing shame, proneness, rumination, anxiety, and stress. I want to flag, honestly, that this episode is working from a summarized account of that research rather than the full original study. So if you want the exact sample size or effect size, that's worth verifying against the primary source before you cite it anywhere formal. But the direction of the finding, mindfulness and self-compassion training, moving shame and rumination downward, shows up consistently enough across the literature that it's a reasonable thing to build a framework around. So the third claim, and this is the one specific to us, self-compassion appears to matter most in racially stressful contexts. The research already mentioned, the Watson Singleton study, found that pattern directly in a Black American sample. A related line of research on racial discrimination and mental health in African American populations points to self-judgment as a factor that can worsen the impact of discrimination, reinforcing the same idea from a different angle. How harshly you turn on yourself after an injury seems to shape how much lasting damage that injury actually does. And then there's a philosophical piece worth including because it protects this whole conversation from being misread. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy treats forgiveness as a distinct moral act, not denial, not forgetting, not pretending something didn't happen. That distinction supports the core thesis of this episode. A debt can be closed without erasing the memory of how it was opened. You're allowed to remember exactly what happened and still refuse to keep paying for it. Accounting can close without amnesia. I'll say this plainly because it's how we do things on this show, So none of what I just walked you through should be treated as the final word. Research evolves, sample sizes vary, and a single study is a data point, not a verdict. If any of this becomes something you want to speak on publicly or build into your own healing plan with a therapist, go find the primary source and confirm the details yourself. What I can tell you with confidence in the direction all of this evidence is pointing towards self-compassion as a skill that reduces the damage, not just a nice sentiment that makes you feel better for 5 minutes. So now let's pause here for a second and locate ourselves because we've covered a lot of ground. We started with a debt that isn't really a debt. It's a feeling dressed up as an obligation. We looked at how that feeling gets constructed in the mind layer by layer. We named how that construction lands differently and often heavier on melanated shoulders. And we just walked through what the research suggests about loosening the grip. So, what we haven't done yet is answer the bigger question underneath all of it. If the debt wasn't ever really owed, who exactly do we think we owe it to? For a lot of us, the honest answer isn't myself, it's something higher than that. So let's go there next. So now let's talk about this somewhere the research alone can't fully go. Because for a lot of us, the moral debt isn't just psychological, right? It's spiritual. It feels like it's owed to something bigger than our own minds. So scripture draws a line here that's easy to miss if you've only ever heard the punishing half of the message. So 2 Corinthians speak of the person in Christ as a new creation, the old having passed, the new having come. Romans speak directly to this exact confusion, stating plainly that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, right? So not reduced condemnation, not eventually, once you've suffered enough, none. And Psalm 139 gives you the other half of that same coin, an invitation to honest self-examination, asking to have the heart searched and to be led in the right way without a trace of self-hatred attached to that request. That's worth noticing because it tells you accountability and self-condemnation were never supposed to be the same practice. You can examine yourself honestly and still walk away whole. Now, different faith traditions land on this same shape from different angles. Materials from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints describe repentant sin as something that need not continue to trouble a person. The memory over time becoming something closer to a blessing than a prison. I'll say clearly, that's one tradition's framing, and if it doesn't match your own theology, take what's useful and leave the rest. But the broader pattern across these sources points to the same direction: confession, restoration, and renewal. Not an endless meter running in the background of your life. Here's a way to hold this in your spirit. Conviction restores. Condemnation just keeps you circling the drain. If what you're feeling is moving you toward repair, that's conviction, and it's doing its job. But if what you're feeling is just keeping you in the same loop with no exit, that's not spiritual discipline. That's a debt someone convinced you God was still collecting on. And he was never the one keeping that account open. So let's zoom out even further, right? Because there's a way of seeing this that reframes the entire mistake, right? So not just what happened, but what it was for. So Deepak Chopra has written about failure as a part of the evolution of consciousness, rather than proof of unworthiness. The idea that setbacks aren't evidence you're broken, but material your awareness uses to expand. I want to be clear that is his framing, right? Not a scientific consensus, but it's worth sitting with because it maps cleanly onto everything the psychology already told us. Mistakes as information producing events, not permanent verdicts. So here's the distinction that pulls this whole episode together. Guilt as a signal versus guilt as identity. Signal says something here needs repair. Identity says I am the damage. The first one can actually guide you somewhere. The second one just traps your energy in the same loop the rumination research already described. Replaying, reconvicting, never arriving. Some spiritual traditions describe the soul learning through contrast. Without failure, there's no real discernment of wisdom, no genuine humility, no boundaries you actually understand the value of, because you've never needed one before. So, looking at it that way, the debt you've been carrying wasn't a punishment being extracted from you, it was a tuition. It was the entrance fee into a level of maturity you couldn't have reached any other way. So think about what you actually know now that you didn't know before that mistake happened. The boundary you finally set, the pattern you finally recognized 3 steps earlier than you used to, the apology you know how to give now, cleanly, without over-explaining or under-owning it. None of that came from the version of you that hadn't failed yet. All of it came from the version that walked through the failure and kept walking. That doesn't mean the mistake didn't matter. It means the mistake was never supposed to be the whole story. It was chapter 1 of a story where you were always going to become someone who understood something you didn't understand before. The curriculum doesn't end when the exam is hard. It ends when the lesson is learned. And once it's learned, staying enrolled in the same class is not devotion. It's just standing still. So, how do you actually close this out? Not in theory, but in practice, starting today. First, name the debt story out loud, even if it's just to yourself. Say the sentence plainly. I am acting like this mistake still owns me. Naming it takes it out of the background hum of your thoughts and puts it somewhere you can actually examine it. You can't renegotiate a debt you refuse to admit you're still paying. Second, separate guilt from identity. Every single time the old story tries to resurface, I did something harmful, is a sentence about an action. I am harmful is a sentence about your entire being. And it was never true, even on your worst day. When you catch the identity version showing up, don't argue with it, just correct the sentence. The same way you'd correct a misquote. That's not accurate. Here's what actually happened. Third, ask what repair is actually still owed, and then stop paying once that repair is actually complete. Not once you feel like you've suffered enough. Once the actual repair, quote unquote, the apology, the amends, the changed behavior is done. Suffering past that point isn't justice. It's just momentum, and momentum on its own doesn't know when to stop unless you're the one who tells it to. Fourth, replace replay with learning. Every time the memory surfaces, don't relive it. Extract from it one lesson, one boundary, one new practice going forward. Then let the memory go back to being a memory instead of a courtroom. If you've already extracted the lesson and the memory shows up again anyway, that's your cue to redirect your attention on purpose, not to relitigate the case one more time. Fifth, right? So, practice self-compassion plainly and without performance. This is painful, and pain is a part of being human, right? And that is a complete sentence. You don't need to earn the right to say it to yourself. You don't need a witness to make it official. you're already allowed to say it in the car, in the shower, in the middle of a completely ordinary Tuesday. Sixth, reduce the rumination itself through whatever grounds you: prayer, journaling, meditation, movement. The goal isn't to never think about it again. The goal is to stop the loop from running on autopilot so that when memory does show up, it shows up as a visitor instead of a landlord. And like, bro, I'm telling you, that is actually what I'm practicing in real time as we speak, because I brought up and I mentioned, some of the relationship conflicts and adversities or whatnot. And I am in the process of, wanting to make amends and clear up any misunderstandings and, identify any actions and thoughts and emotions that may have stemmed from traumatic experiences, past experiences, right? Any of the times where I've been overly critical of myself, right? Any of the moral debt that I've held on to from the projection of others or the projection of my own onto myself and thinking that it is my identity and so on and so forth. And so, while I'm in kind of this waiting phase, right? Because, she's going through her processes of thinking and processing about what happened our last conversation and how that truly made her feel and how that changed how she felt about me, whether it was temporarily or just altogether. And so I'm just kind of in the dark about the fullness of what that is and what, I may be coming to as far as whenever we were to have that conversation again, right? And revisit that and try and have another heart to heart. So she's completely aware of my intentions, but since I'm not aware of hers, sometimes my mind ruminates on the last conversation, how that made her feel, what that could be making her think about me. And then I would internalize those thoughts and feelings as if, that is me and it's not me, right? And so I'm thinking about, maybe she doesn't want to, continue that relationship. Maybe she doesn't want to rebuild. Maybe she doesn't want to see it through, yada, 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 right? Maybe she lost love in me. Maybe she lost trust in me. Maybe all is true, and maybe she's still willing to work it out. Or maybe she's still willing to get over that and grow from it, right? But I don't know. And so I start ruminating on it. Oh, she's not replying, and I'm giving her time to process things, right? And so on and so forth, so it's like, hey, I'm giving her time, but how much time does she need? And I can't expect her to reply on my own timeline, so on and so forth. So the rumination of all of that, right? You know what I'm saying? How that cause stress and anxiety, because I actually do care. And one of the comments that was said that I don't care, that I never care. And that's not true. I can list all of the times where I showed up, where I went the extra mile, where I gave guidance or advice because I cared. And all of that got dismissed simply because I made a comment about stepping back, even though I wasn't really allowed to develop a fullness of a complete thought in that moment, because it was interrupted simply because she wanted an answer right then and there, instead of allowing the time to marinate, to have that conversation for me to actually, think things through, think out my feelings and my thoughts and my words, right? And where the source of these things was actually truly coming from. And so, that was all of that. So what I started to do was, I started journaling. I was reading about my Bible and, meditating and again, recording this podcast about this entire topic about moral debt, right? So the goal isn't to never think about it again. The goal is to stop the loop from running on autopilot so that when the memory does show up, it shows up as a visitor instead of a landlord, right? And for us specifically, Melanated family, add one more layer to all of this, right? Name external harm honestly before you turn the blame inward. Don't let a world that mistreated you convince you that mistreatment was evidence of your own defect. Refuse to spiritualize abuse or racism as personal failure. What was done to you is not a referendum, of your character, on your character, right? Use your community, your worship, your testimony to normalize growth without shame, out loud, where other people can hear it and recognize themselves in it, and start treating self-compassion as what the research actually suggests it is. Not softness, but resistance. A direct refusal to let internalized devaluation win the argument it's been trying to win your whole life, right? So a direct refusal to let internalized devaluation win the argument it's been trying to win your whole life, right? So Life after death is to, so picture it for a second. Not the mistake, the version of you. What exists after you stopped paying for it? That version of you remembers exactly what happened. Nothing gets erased. Nothing gets pretended away. But the memory sits differently. It's not a wound you keep reopening to check if it still hurts. It's a scar you can point to and say, that's where I learned something I couldn't have learned any other way. That version of you hears criticism without translating it into a life sentence, makes a new mistake without immediately reopening every old account to see if this proves the pattern, extends the same grace outward that they finally learn to extend inward. Because once you stop treating your own past as an unpaid debt, you stop needing other people's mistakes to stay unpaid too. That version of you also has more room. That's the part people don't expect. All that energy that used to go toward guarding the ledger, checking the balance, bracing for the next reminder of what you did, that energy goes somewhere else now. Into the relationship you almost didn't trust yourself to be good at. Into the work you almost talked yourself out of. Because some old voice said you hadn't earned it yet. Into rest, actual rest, the kind that doesn't come with a side of guilt for taking it. That's not the absence of accountability. It's what accountability looks like once it's actually finished its job. So let me leave you with the only question that actually matters once the debt is paid. What will you build with everything you've been spending on a sentence that was already served? Peace, love, and elevation, family. Until next time.